Greetings to the brightest audience in the country. This is Real Science Radio. I'm Fred Williams.
And I'm Ryan Williams, creation speaker and software engineer.
Well, Ryan, it's great to have you back in the studio. You brought up a topic to me a little while ago about the pyramids. And I'm like, yeah, that would be a great topic to do a show about. I remember not long after Bob passed and I was carrying on the show, a listener emailed in, hey, you guys got to do a show on the pyramids. And I'd kind of forgotten about it. And then when you brought up pyramids, it kind of, reminded me. And Ryan, we just went to the ICC conference last month in July. Doug and I did. And Ann Habermill, who's prolific writer on biblical history, she gave a talk on the pyramids. So this is pretty good timing to talk about the pyramids. And also, there's so many neat things that we're going to try to answer questions like, well, who built the pyramids? Were the pyramids built before the time of the flood? And did they survive the flood? Are the pyramids some big power plant that some people actually believe? There's a lot of interesting speculation. Are they somehow built by aliens? All kinds of questions. But Ryan, before we get into all this really interesting stuff, I did want to mention we've got the Hydroplate virtual conference coming up next September. It's September 21st through the 23rd. So go to hydroplate.org and you can register there for this conference. There's also a place that you can print out flyers that has the QR code on it. So if you could hand those out, bring them to your church, or if you're going to college or have access to a college, take them to your college campuses. Let's try to get information out on what should be a really good conference. We've got a lot of the top speakers on hydroplate theory going to be attending that conference.
Oh yeah, that should be a good conference, and it should be a fun show today. There's a lot of interesting and wacky and some of them kind of cool theories about the pyramids. Ton of questions, so we'll see. Maybe we can answer. But yeah, that conference should be a really good one too. And speaking of the conference, see the news about the NASA DART test last September, where they intentionally crashed a spaceship into the asteroid known as Dimorphos to change its trajectory.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Ryan. So one of our hydroplate theorists or supporters, Kevin Lee, he actually predicted that this would happen. I pulled this up. Kevin Lee, first of all, he presented the hydroplate theory to ICR. We want to thank ICR for allowing that to happen. He did that last December. But anyways, he wrote an email to this prominent secular astronomer at Washington, I believe Washington University. The guy's name is Donald Brownlee. And he wrote to him saying that the DART test is based on the flawed assumption that this Dimorphos asteroid is just this big rock. And it's not. It's a bunch of boulders, loosely held together. And he said that their physics model is just going to fall to shreds. And again, it's a bunch of rocks held together loosely. So immediately after the DART test, Kevin predicted the following, and I'm quoting him directly. As such, Dimorphos will lose some of its mass, and quite possibly, despite NASA's promises that the DART mission would not create a hazard to our planet, put some of the ejected rocks into orbit paths that will someday impact Earth. If so, I suspect they will call the swarm the DART meteor shower. He makes this prediction. It's kind of like, shooting apples in a barrel. And I know I say that wrong, but I'm going to continue it because it's a tradition. That's not that quite how that saying goes. Well, it's the new saying. It's an RSR saying. So
yeah, that is pretty interesting. And if they would have had the knowledge that the hydroplate theory would say before they did the experiment, they would know what these asteroids are made of. They would know that these are just clumps of earth rocks that are together, and that maybe shooting this thing isn't the best idea.
Yeah, because they try to change its trajectory. And I think Kevin gave the analogy of a pool. When you start a pool game, the cue ball hits the racked balls and the balls go all different directions. But imagine so many more boulders just shooting out. It's not going to be this piece of rock now going at a different angle and not entering Earth's orbit. So anyways, that's all interesting. It's all fun stuff. It's all scientists work for Walt Brown. I want to make a plea. I know we have some listeners. We have plenty of listeners who support other theories like catastrophic plate tectonics and exploding planets. And I literally just heard at the ICC this last July that, quote, asteroids triggered the flood is well established. I just really want people to consider the evidence for hydroplate theory. This evidence has been around for a long time. And I'd really like to know, for example, how does a floating rock pile, how does that fit in with catastrophic plate tectonics? Have they ever made predictions or considered, this stuff. So I'd be curious, like catastrophic plate tectonics and these other theories for the flood, can they explain or account for a lot of this stuff we're seeing in space, these astronomical events?
Well, yeah, looking at kind of what, because Creation Ministries International, they're the ones who put out the Creation magazine, the show that we normally do, going through it, and they always do a great job on most of their stuff. But
and we went to their conference last summer, which was really good.
That was great. That was a blast. But their article on this, it just kind of didn't really address that Dimorphos, the asteroid they tried to move, was a rock pile. They just kind of, instead of going that route, they basically went the route of how bad it'd be if the meteors and asteroids would hit the surface, because they think that boulder shower has somewhere in the realm of the power of the Hiroshima bomb.
Yeah. Yep.
And then they talked about this in their article. It's actually kind of interesting. They talked about this one big old meteor, 66 feet, that blew up over over a Russian city. And they said that one had energy 30 times greater than the atomic bomb used in Hiroshima.
30 times greater. Was anyone killed in that one?
No, because it exploded above the surface. So, and that was in 2013.
Walt Brown's kind of ahead of the curve on this one. So Ryan, another one we can chalk up to the hydroplate column. So this isn't why we're here today. It's always fun to talk about these recent news items. So let's dive into the pyramids. And you're our RSR pyramid expert. I know you've been interested in this topic for a long time.
The resident expert. I guess I don't know if I'd call myself the resident expert, but maybe that's just
the resident expert or the resonant. So resonance is part of the topic of the show today.
Nice little foreshadow. That's good stuff there. So yeah, kind of just one of the things we want to talk about these, one of the takeaways we had before we get into it is just another example of how ancient people, they're not dummies compared to us. They're not, just sitting in caves, throwing rocks at each other and, laughing and, bonking each other in the head with sticks. And, obviously, even secular people, they know that ancient Egyptians and that long ago people were smart and they could do stuff. But the pyramids really are really impressive, just impressive structural works and even works of art, because back then they had to have looked really pretty. There's, you can look up pictures online of how people think that they looked back then. And they were really beautiful structures.
So you were speaking of the genius of ancient man, and we did a show on that. You go to rsr.org/genius, and there's so many examples in the past of just how it's so obvious that as you go back farther, men were super intelligent. And we know just from genetics that our genetic load increases every generation. We carry on a few more mutations and we become a little bit more dumb each generation. I mean, God has an ingenious quality control system, so we're not deteriorating isn't maybe as great as some people think, but we are slowly deteriorating. And we see that in like IQ tests that you go back, every 20 years, they've got scientific evidence that goes back at, the end of like the 1800s, and just how much better people were doing on IQ tests. There's a lot of evidence for that. Just go to rsr.org/genius. There are several examples on that page. Ryan, I think there's one of ancient cartoons. Do you remember seeing a few on that page?
It's like ancient, like ancient animations, calligraphy, things like that is like just beyond survival instincts that,
not the grunting ape-like man living in a cave and, like you said, throwing rocks for fun.
Yeah.
So we know that there is an incredible intelligence behind building the pyramids.
Oh yeah. Yeah. The project itself, even the administration of the project itself, like looking outside all the stuff that they had to know to build them. Over 20,000 workers that worked on this thing, and it lasted over 20 years. So this is a very long time. They had it was composed of 2 million limestone blocks that.
So this is the Giza pyramid.
Yeah, these are I guess we never really just said pyramids and hope that people knew, but yeah, these are the Great Pyramids of Giza, as they call them. So not any of the ones like in America. There's these ones specifically.
And most pyramids are actually in the Americas, which is an interesting fact. But now Giza, I think it was 2 million stones, and each of those stones weigh more than like an adult elephant, to give you a perspective. And there's 2 million of them.
Yeah.
So this thing is super heavy. And so
They've got to be cut correctly to be the exact size they want to be. And then,
well, you mentioned the labor force. So I know a lot of people have the impression that the pyramids were built by slaves. Is that true?
according to what it's kind of, one of the, I guess you could say, things that secular people and Christians would agree on, at least some of the Christian scholars that have done research, is they're most likely not even built by any kind of slave. They were most likely just Egyptian people, probably of the poorer variety, most likely. But because, and one of the evidence they have is they've found tombs very nearby the pyramid with the remains of people who built the pyramids. So basically, the Egyptians buried the workers of the pyramids in a respectful, honorable way, and not the way that they would have done to slaves who built the pyramids. So that's one thing. I guess you could call it a misnomer, but most likely, can't say for certain, but most likely it was just Egyptian people who built it. Sorry for all out there, it wasn't aliens. So
So Ryan, what are some interesting facts, maybe before we get in, not those facts that are like controversial. It'll be fun to talk about those in a second, but what are some, interesting tidbits? I know that when I read a little bit before this show, and you've done a lot more research than I have, that we just covered one, it wasn't built by slaves. What are other interesting facts that generally most people agree with?
Yeah. So we touched on it. Over 20 years is how long it took. 20,000 workers, non-slaves.
20 years to build one pyramid, or all of them?
I think that was 20 years for all of them. I think they say they called the Great Pyramid the biggest one of the three.
Okay.
That one
group.
Took,
gotcha.
Yeah. That one took, I think, 10 years. So I guess the other two were 20 because I'm not sure the order of them actually, but they were a little small. They were a little smaller than the Great one.
And even if that's true, I mean, because we don't know probably for sure, but that's still really impressive. You think of how long it takes to build these impressive skyscrapers. Mm-hmm. So and these things are even more impressive. And you still don't know how they were built. You can't. How do you replicate that? Yeah,
they had to do all these like complicated like pulley system things to just get those blocks up, because those things are massive. Remember, the purpose of it was built as a tomb for a guy named Pharaoh Cheops during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu. So there was and then the guy Visor Enkef. And I think that Visor is a title, but I'm not 100% sure on that. He was a half-brother of Pharaoh Khufu, and he was the chief of all works for the king, and he was the overseer of this project. They're a little bit different than a lot of the other pyramids that exist around the world, because a lot of those are called step pyramids, and they're flat on the outside. They don't have the steps like you think when you think of like Mayan pyramids or those kind of pyramids. They're a little bit different. There was this one guy who pretty well describes the building of the pyramids. His name was Merer, and he was just an administrator guy. And these guys, Pierre Tallet and Gregory Marunard, found a pretty detailed logbook that was written from this guy. These guys were archaeologists, and he goes through a pretty interesting, just lays out how they were built, and he wrote a lot about it, which is cool. So there actually is some, it's not just all speculation on how this stuff worked. We do have some actual physical evidence and writings of how these things were built. A couple other interesting things before we get into some of the more fun stuff, I guess. Is you've got there's 2 million limestone blocks, but those weren't the only materials used to build the pyramids. So the top of it was solid gold, which is pretty neat. That's not there anymore because it was most likely stolen at some point. Mm-hmm. So the normal blocks were limestone, but then there's like white limestone that was used on the outside. So it was like kind of reflective and had to have looked really pretty, but all that's since eroded away or been stolen. You've got,
and just to dovetail off that. So I was reading on the pyramids just yesterday, some guy, and I can't remember when, like maybe the 1200s, tried to demolish the pyramids. And he didn't get very far. They spent a ton of money trying to tear into one of these, and they ended up canceling the project because they just couldn't do it. It had taken years if not decades, to demolish them.
That's funny. I didn't know that. That's interesting. Wonder what the reasoning was for trying to destroy them.
Who knows? Maybe to try to get inside. Maybe they're looking for a pot of gold. Who knows?
That's pretty funny. But yeah, you've also got granite blocks that were brought from really far away in a place called Aswan that's like 800 kilometers away.
So you mentioned granite blocks, so that'll play into later into some of the more interesting theories on the pyramids. And that kind of has a tie-in with the hydroplate theory.
Yeah.
In a way. So that'll be interesting.
And those white limestone, like that was used for the outside, that was gathered from a quarry on the opposite side of the Nile. So they had to transport those blocks by boat. It's like, so those had to be pretty, they might not be as heavy as a normal limestone blocks, but to get them by boat over that river, that doesn't sound like it's for the faint of heart.
No.
And
they didn't have like cargo ships back then. But
exactly.
Who knows how well? I'm sure their ships were really well built.
Oh yeah, they had to have been if they were able to get those things across the river. But it'd be interesting to see what the ships looked like. Would be kind of a cool thing to find out someday.
Yeah. So Ryan, what about of course the secular scientists and archaeologists? They're not going to agree with us on a global flood. Of course, they deny global flood because they deny God. But there's some Christians, I think you mentioned that you saw a video where the claim was that the pyramids were built before the flood, which means they would have had to survive the flood. Now, what's your research tell you on that?
Yeah. So I've heard that theory that they survived the flood or built before the flood. That's pretty unlikely, if not just, flat out say, that's not how it happened. Because there's, like, for example, the pyramids they were built on like sediment bearing rock, like sedimentary or fossil bearing sediment layers. So
gotcha.
That means that those sedimentary rocks underneath the pyramids were laid down during the flood because they have fossils. And that's where the vast majority of the fossil record was from the flood.
Yeah. So if you think that the pyramids came before the flood, then you have to explain why is there a layer beneath it that has fossilized fish and whatever, fossilized life in it. That would have to have been its own flood. It'd have to be some local flood to bury, because you can't get fossilization, a lot of this stuff, without rapid burial, burying it quickly in cement, cement like a sedimentary layers. So that right there is pretty convincing evidence that they were not built before the flood.
Unless the flood swept them up and they stayed in one piece and, we're kind of moving around in the water and then just
they were really well built
back down on top of
Do you know what the guy, how can he get around that as a problem? Because I remember you said you watched a video where some guy was pushing that idea.
I can't remember. Their main idea is they
probably just glossed over, or they just didn't tell you about that problem.
Probably ignored it. Because I think like the main point was the guy said that the common date for the pyramids when they were built is guessed to be at like 2500 BC, and the flood is guessed to be at 2350 BC. So the date, by the date itself, the pyramids would have been built first. But that date for the pyramids is it's surprisingly unreliable for living in the 21st century. It's surprising that that's the best we got, because literally how they date them is they just look at this one guy who lived also in the BC era just basically took a list of the pharaohs and put them back to back, and then counted their years of reign, and then was like, oh, we get to this number. But the issue with that is a lot of the times there were different dynasties where pharaohs reigned at the same time, or sometimes father and son reigned concurrently for a little while. So
Creation Ministries International, CMI, Gary Bates has I think a really good article. If you're looking into the chronology of, the timeline for the pyramids, for Egyptian history, just go to CMI and we'll provide a link to it. He calls it a good starting point because Christians really debate on this too and disagree on the dates. Everyone from Bryant Wood, who's, a great archaeologist, Ann Habermill has her own ideas. Tim Mahoney, he's got his idea. He's got a really great video called Patterns of Evidence. I don't think anyone's quite pinned it down. If you want to look into the complications behind it and just a good starting point, again, Gary Bates has a good article at CMI on that. So it sounds like to me that guy maybe was using the secular version, where if you take Egyptian history and use it from a secular lens, it pushes everything back before the flood and creation. So that, of course, doesn't work.
Yeah, that won't
So-
work. Even biblically, it just doesn't fit, because right before the flood in Genesis 6:7, when God's talking about what he's going to do in the flood, he says, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land. And this, then I kind of was, when reading about it, I think it was Answers in Genesis who had this article. The Hebrew word for blot out is makah, which basically just means to wipe clean, annihilate, be removed. So that seems like it's a strong way to describe the purpose of the flood. And based on that sentence, it doesn't sound like God wanted to wipe clean not just people, but the legacy and their history too of wickedness. So it'd be weird if he left these structures up that were really, just that
Made
we
by
still
man.
that we look back now and still remember as like a big historical and legacy piece. Doesn't
Yeah.
seem like a blotting out if they were built before the flood and somehow survived.
So Ryan, that makes me think of when you say that God, used the flood and it wiped out pretty much everything. It does remind me of Van Havermill's talk at ICC, where her idea is that the pyramids that were built after the flood and around the world and after the dispersion of the Tower of Babel, man remembered how this thing was engineered, and they built kind of like replicas of it in a sense. It's like man's impression of the original Tower of Babel, and here they are building these things again. So I thought that's an interesting idea. I think it makes, pretty good sense. And just man's attempt, kind of, again, trying to build a tower towards God, but maybe not quite as big, so they don't want to get dispersed again. I don't know. Interesting ideas on that. And Ryan, it did also, and I think I sent this to you, one of our listeners sent in something I thought was pretty good insight on the pyramids from a biblical point of view. So he said, if you look around the world, you'll notice pyramids scattered in various locations. Most of these are ancient structures, and he lists some of the pyramids around the world. And he says, why are they so similar? Why all the basic structure? And then he references a verse in Revelation 21, verse 16. And let me read this real quick. The city is laid out as a square. Its length is as great as its breadth. And he measured the city with the reed, 12,000 furlongs. Its length, breadth, and height are equal. And he writes that this is assumed that it's the shape of a cube. However, if one reads the passage carefully, it can also be read as being in the shape of a pyramid. Equal length and width is a square. Equal in height, this could be consistent with a pyramid, right?
It could.
And
It's
you think
interesting.
of those NASA pictures. Did you see those? The NASA pictures of the pyramids are really cool. And
They are pretty cool.
It shows you how well done these were.
Yeah, and they're
how
like
they've
all
survived
even
the
too. It's not like they're at weird angles. They're like
Yeah.
boom, boom, boom. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I know one of the interesting facts of I think the Giza pyramid is how almost perfect a square that it is, and the ingenuity to build something that big and have it as a perfect square. And again, if you're watching the video, you'll see what the pictures we're showing you of this. And so I encourage you, if you're on audio, if you get a chance to go watch the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. So he goes on to say, also equal in height, this could be consistent with a pyramid. In the pyramid of the city of God, God's position would be the apex of the pyramid. And like you mentioned, the Giza one had gold at the top. Thus, God forbid his people from worshiping in the high places because this was the position of God. And then he mentions Lucifer as quoted in Isaiah 14:13. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest side of the north. And he highlights north, which is interesting because I remember reading an interesting fact about Giza is that it's like perfectly aligned with the North Pole.
Yeah, they're like, I think they're within a degree. I'd have to double check that, but I think they're within a degree of air away from true north, the alignment of the pyramids, which is kind of remarkable. How long ago they were built, the knowledge that we assume that these people have, which they obviously had to have had, or else they just got super lucky. In that Isaiah verse you're talking about, how it says the mount of congregation, which a mountain has a peak at the top.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
just like a pyramid would. So
Yeah.
maybe, it's tough to speculate. Maybe it is just a normal mountain, or maybe that is just the apex of the city. Who knows? It's cool.
Yeah. So one last thing he mentions, he notes that a pyramid has three edges or forms a triangle on its side. So if you look at the pyramid from the side, it's a shape of a triangle. And this is consistent with the number 3 being the number for the Godhead. A pyramid itself has four sides. This is consistent with the number of the whole world. For example, the four winds of heaven, 4 points on a compass. There's more details in this that we could get into, but his point is that the devil continues his attempts to imitate God. And so that kind of fits with what Ann Habermas was saying too, that this is, again, man, his rebellion against God. He's building these pyramids around the world. There's more pyramids in the Americas than there are anywhere else in the world. So Ryan, just an interesting thing to consider. I wanted to get to some of the interesting theories, and one of them is that you had brought attention to me. I wasn't aware of this at all, is that there are some theories out there that the pyramids are like power plants. They were built by the Egyptians to generate electricity. So what's up with that?
Yeah, that's like, of the random theories that are out there, I think that one's kind of the most fun and kind of interesting one too.
It's not totally far-fetched.
Yeah,
it's not like
it's
wild
not incredibly far-fetched.
type
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
It's kind of cool. It's interesting. There's, some, you could say, I guess, coincidences, like the materials, the way they're built, because the pyramids, they're not just like a big old block of full stone. Like, they have chambers inside. Mm-hmm. So they have what's called the king's and queen's chamber, which is where the king and the queen were buried. And then the people who love the power plant theory, say that that's all a hoax and that they weren't buried there at all. But those were actually,
don't they claim
very
they didn't
important.
find human remains in the pyramids?
Yeah, they say there's no human remains or artifacts in there at all. But the common counter argument would be that they were stolen, which does happen a lot, because there's a lot of other tombs in, ancient Egypt. There's not a ton inside these that's been stolen. So that's reasonable. But some of the other stuff they talk about is interesting, because there's that white limestone that's used on the outside is a pretty good insulator. It can carry electrical current. I guess we'll get into the granite blocks in a sec, but even underneath the pyramid, there's a lot of, there's groundwater that's been found underneath. There's a lot of underground tunnels underneath there that, if water was flowing through, the theory goes that water can generate electricity, as we know it does, because we use water in our hydroelectric dams and whatnot.
I saw some guy build a smaller model of, I believe, the Giza pyramid. And when he ran water through it, he was able to cause a resonance. We mentioned the vibration earlier, and how that we were going to talk about that later in the show. So this guy's a proponent of the pyramids being a power plant. And so he ran water through this experimental model that he had created. And again, he got some vibration. So now that gets to, if you get this thing resonating and you've got granite, and they've found granite in the pyramids.
Yes, that's where the granite comes in. A lot of those internal chambers, that's what their walls were made with.
So why did they choose granite for the internal the chambers inside the pyramid?
Especially because that granite had to be brought from really far away too, like 800 kilometers. So it would have been a lot easier if you're just building a tomb to make that with the same limestone you're using outside.
Other stones you have nearby. So you got granite. And granite has quartz in it. And guess what happens when you bend quartz? You get voltage. You get electricity, the piezoelectric effect, which, again, is related to the hydroplate theory. Because Walt Brown has an interesting idea that when the crusts are fluttering, you're creating all kinds of voltage. And that's why you see lightning with earthquakes. The earthquakes are, they're bending the crust. Crust is kind of, it's vibrating, resonating, and you do get electricity. This has been documented in secular journals now. It was doubted for literally a century or more. They just thought it was not a hoax, but a phenomenon that people were mistaken when they claimed they saw electric bolts coming up from the surface of the earth during earthquakes. Well, it turns out that's all true. And it's, again, the piezoelectric effect. We'll provide a link to Walt Brown's explanation of where the origin of radioactivity. We believe his theory has the best explanation for it, because where do you find radioactive elements? You find them in the continental crust. Now, why wouldn't you just find it everywhere around the globe if what, like Lawrence Krauss says, is true, that, this stuff came from space? Well, why would it concentrate in the continental crust? Well, we believe it does because the granite and the quartz and these high voltages, it caused the radioactivity, which make a lot of sense. Also, in the context of the Bible, God created everything perfect. And on day 7, he said, everything was very good. why would we have radiation at that if everything was very good? Because radiation, as you know, it's harmful. Over time, it causes more and more harm to our bodies. So the flood would make sense that was the origin of radioactivity. So just again, an aside into somewhat of a connection to hydroplate theory.
Yeah.
Had
like
to get
there
another
always is.
hydroplate theory thing in there. Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of we can take a second to get into how it actually would work in theory, because it's kind of interesting. There's this guy, his name's Christopher Dunn. He wrote this book called The Giza Power Plant, and I've never read the book, but I've read, an article about the book and, a few videos about the book. So I don't know if this guy's a weirdo or not, to be honest. But he was, he was an engineer for the civil and military aviation. So he's, an engineer, so he's not just like a goon, I guess.
Yeah.
So he has some credibility here. And
I think I saw a video of his and he looks like Larry Flint, but not a similarity I'd want. But anyways. And I think it was him that also pointed out that pyramid, if you break that word down, pyramid, it's pyra, fire, middle. So fire in the middle, it's kind of an interesting perspective. Yeah. So, and Ryan, before we forget, so one of the greatest inventors and minds in really the history of U.S., and actually this guy's not from the United States, he's from Serbia, this guy named Nikola Jokic. Okay,
champion?
NBA champion, NBA champion. Yeah, I should have worn my NBA championship jersey today. But Nikola Tesla. So everybody knows the word Tesla, and he was a great inventor. This is a guy that really he has patents that pretty much, in my mind, established that he came up with. He's the discoverer of alternating current.
Yeah, AC electricity.
We're doing this show right now because we've got alternating current that then gets converted into lower voltage to run all this equipment in here. And guess who invented the transformer? Nikola Tesla. And the transformer is one of the things that allows you to step up or step down voltage. So you got this three-phase power going through all over, all the power lines. And we can't run that kind of power into our stuff or else we blow everything to smithereens. But he invented the transformer to step down the voltage. So things like, our laptop can be powered up with, from the AC power that's again stepped down. Ryan, so this guy's a genius, really. Mm-hmm. And he's a guy who thinks that the pyramids were a power plant, and he tried to replicate it. He
was fascinated with them. He was fascinated with them and tried to replicate it.
That's why this isn't a crackpot idea. I'm not going to say that we don't endorse it. I don't endorse it. But
I would say I probably don't believe it's true, but it's not as out there as some of the... Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff.
And I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out to be something that's legitimate. But, so we're giving it, we're letting the audience know about it. I didn't know about this until you told me about it. And Nikola Tesla is not some crackpot.
He's not a weirdo.
Well, he's probably was weird.
He was a weird guy. It's one that's hard to be that smart and not a bit odd. But he was an actual, like a genius. Yeah. So he's, not a tinfoil hat weirdo, I guess you could say. But because he tried to replicate it. He basically built what they call the Wardenclyffe Tower, and he built it in Colorado Springs for a very specific reason, because that location, I can't remember exactly how, but it somehow corresponds to the location of the pyramids on the planet, because that's a good spot for some of this natural stuff to take place.
Okay.
And basically his tower was designed to, in sort of how the pyramid power plant theory goes, is that, you generate this electricity, but what's really remarkable is, if it's true, this electricity is dispersed wirelessly. So from the top, it's dispersed wirelessly. So there's not a need for our power lines. That would all be unnecessary, because wireless power is dispersed just through the air. Through the theory goes is it would go through the atmosphere, through the ionosphere, because you can ionize those atoms somehow. Way smarter people than me would know how that works. But then you can disperse it through the air and then have receivers here and there that then can receive it, which would be remarkable, really remarkable if it worked. Tesla's tower was able to create a short-range magnetic field too.
Okay.
So
it
just...
And so he could create a magnetic field?
really short range.
Yeah, but so
basically.
just
But
as an engineer,
yeah.
as with my background in electrical engineering, I know that means he could create current from this thing because you can get a current from a magnetic field and vice versa. Current creates a magnetic field. So, well, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that. Again, we don't know for sure, and I tend to be a little bit more skeptical of these things until I have like really concrete evidence, and that's kind of the way we've always operated at Real Science Radio. But this one it's plausible. It's not unreasonable. It's not, like you said, tinfoil hat conspiracy stuff.
It's not like we're
just,
talking about moon landing being faked out.
Yeah,
here.
and this is an
Something like
area,
that.
this isn't, it wasn't built in Area 51 and shooting down alien ships or having aliens transported. And I think I remember reading
It
one.
is funny though when you see videos on this of people who love the theory, they'll show these things where the pyramids are shooting out electricity from the top. It's pretty funny.
Yeah. And I remember reading, or actually I watched a video clip of one guy saying wild crackpot stuff like it's a transporter, like in Star Trek. That's why you don't find any bodies, because they got transported up somewhere to
trying to
the
beam them up,
Orion,
trying
because apparently it's aligned similar to the belt of Orion, things like that. So
Yeah, and there's
some wild ideas.
There's other dumb ones where they're thinking that it was designed to raise some guy back from the dead or something. It's okay, let's.
That sounds like Ghostbusters type stuff.
Yeah, and there are reasonable rebuttals to this too that make sense. Like one example is we don't see hieroglyphs of Egyptians using phones or whatnot. There's no electrical devices that have been found. No drawings of electrical devices apart from this one that people try to make you think is a light bulb.
It's a light
But
bulb.
it
Yeah,
could
I saw that one.
It could be something else too.
Yeah.
Or, who knows? Maybe they just used electricity different than we do now, if it actually worked. But then there's other just scientific rebuttals. Like you got, if it could be generated inside, you still got to get the electricity through all those normal limestone blocks, which would have been hard to do. There's one guy on some like forum page, and he's like, you could have the best electrical inductor in the world, but it's not going to help you get it through 70 meters of limestone. So there's problems with it, but it does. And I guess one other rebuttal that people have, this is actually a rebuttal I thought of in my head. They wonder, because you wonder why the Egyptians chose these materials, why they choose this quartz-rich granite, and that was really hard to get there. But, the Egyptians did a lot of weird stuff. There's a lot of stuff we look back and we're like, yeah, that's a bit,
yeah. So they may
quirky.
have some worship,
Yeah.
their God worship, little g gods worship that made them compelled to do that.
Maybe their freaks like loved quartz or stone or whatever. So they're like, oh, you gotta get some of that in there.
Yeah.
So and I think that's, a thing, but it does make you wonder.
It makes you wonder, because the guys like Tesla, who probably would know that limestone is, its inductive properties, and he did create a magnetic field outside of it, which can generate a current. So to me, it's worth, people, if they're interested in it, keep researching it. I think that's worthwhile.
Then who knows? Maybe they tried and failed too. Maybe they wanted it to be, but it just didn't work. So
that could be one of the questions about the pyramids. Why did they stop building the pyramids? So one of the answers is because they were done. They had their power. They had their power plants were done. They stopped building them. But I know that's one of the mysteries of the pyramids, is why did they, suddenly they just stopped building them.
They built 3 and then just were like, okay,
yeah, in that particular complex. Yeah.
One thing that also makes you think it could have failed, like the project failed if it was that case, is there was a pretty big period of economic and political instability after the building of these things. So you figured that if it would have worked, they'd be, raking it in, because you've got wireless electricity being generated. That imagine if,
so
we
they had
didn't have
Jimmy
to pay
Carter,
for
and
electricity.
then they had a Carter administration, then a Biden, where the economy tanked.
Yeah. Because basically, think about that. Their gas prices were $4 a gallon. But it probably costed a ton of money and a lot of resources. So who knows? Then the dynasties, the kings, just ran out of cash.
Yeah, because those were expensive projects.
Oh yeah.
So,
and since they most likely weren't slaves, that means that they paid the workers somehow. So it's interesting. So who knows if they worked or not? Tough to say. Tough to say if that even was the purpose. Odds are they were just a tomb. But I think it's an interesting one to think about a little bit.
Yep.
But probably are running a little bit low on time, unfortunately.
Yeah. So do you have any concluding thoughts about the pyramids?
Guess, one like last thought is regardless of what its purpose was, these things are pretty impressive structures. Like if you kind of just look at because not just a bunch of blocks laid one on top of the other, they've got these internal chambers that are still intact to this day, despite, all the stuff that's happened in that region over the years, wars, natural stuff. These chambers are still intact inside, which means they're really structurally sound. They're really smart, impressive feats of structural engineering and just administration, all that. It's pretty cool. And
you're pretty sure these weren't formed by like wind and erosion and natural processes?
Yeah, that's the one thing I'm surprised that no secular historians or people hypothesize that these were just formed by natural processes, and wind blows the rocks and water carries them over, and then they lay on each other
by a hurricane
perfectly.
or tornado here and there.
Yeah, and they're laid on top of each other, and they reach to 139 meters. Because you think that they would want to think about that idea, considering that's a lot easier to do than our awesome bodies and the world God gave us. So surprised there's no more thinking down that line, but maybe we'll see stuff.
That would be less of a pipe dream and less of wild imagination to say that could happen than we spent years on Real Science Radio talking about just the amazing design of nature of our bodies. Like you said, just to pick an organ, our eyeballs, the trochlea, all those little things that obviously required extraordinary design, extraordinary engineering. The DNA is a computer program language. You're a software engineer. That languages themselves, computer languages themselves, just don't evolve. It's information that doesn't have mass or energy, so it's not materialism. I remember reading recently in Quantum Magazine about how the square root of -1 is an imaginary number, and yet you need imaginary numbers for quantum mechanics to work now. So all these things point to God, an intelligence, an engineering, and the engineering ingenuity of the pyramids really also speaks to the Creator.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, it does speak to the Creator. It's awesome that God made us creative like Him. We're made in His image, so He also made us creative and ingenuitive, and people have been able to create cool stuff like the pyramids, which are we think those are impressive. They pale in comparison to, like you described, our body parts, our eyes, and it'd be cool. It must have been cool to see David and Solomon's temple, how cool that thing was, because the pyramids were built for a literal demon, whatever dumb Egyptian lower G god literally created for a demon. It'd be cool to see how magnificent the temple was, because it's a structure that was built for the glory of God.
Yeah. And the pyramids themselves, it would have been cool to see those back in the day when they were actually like in their era.
Yeah.
Because they say they would have shined brightly. You could have seen them at great distances. They would have been beautiful in their own right with the gold on the top. But then compare that to the work that, David and then, Solomon really in building the temple. That would have been so cool. Hopefully we'll get to watch videos of that, when we get to heaven. But Ryan, we're out of time, unfortunately. But thanks. This is a really cool show.
That was fun.
I really
That was a good
enjoyed
one.
talking about pyramids. There's a lot of things I didn't know about. So I'm glad you raised it. And again, I thank that listener that asked us to do this show 2 years ago. Sorry we took so long to get to it.
Better late than never.
Yeah, that's right. So you can go to rsr.org/store and please help us stay on the air. You can sponsor a show. You can get some of our materials. We've got great stuff. We should have Tim Mahoney's video on patterns of evidence. That is fantastic. I highly recommend, if you have not seen it, help us out and get that DVD and watch it. You'll be impressed. Your mom, my wife, she was thoroughly impressed with that documentary, and she's not really that into documentaries.
Yeah.
She believes all this stuff that we talk about, but she's not as
in touch with the scientific side.
Yeah, but she loved that video because it's so well done. Highly recommend it. There's so many other materials. You should get the videos on the hydroplate theory. It was kind of interesting how you think about the granite and the quartz, and now that we know that creates electricity, voltage.
As you'd say, all scientists work for Walt Brown, even the ancient Egyptian ones.
That's right. So anyways, For Ryan Williams, I'm Fred Williams of Real Science Radio. May God bless you.